I'd first like to thank you all for joining us today. This is our inaugural colloquium speaker series for the Cultivating the Environmental Humanities program that we're starting here at Rowan. So we're really pleased to have with us today Professor McKay Jenkins from the University of Delaware, where he's the Cornelius Tillman Professor of English and Journalism, and also started their environmental humanities program about 6 or 7 years ago. So he's been writing about the natural world and people for about 25 years, the author of the book Food Fight, GMOs, and the Future of the American Diet, which examines contentious national debate over the safety, politics, and environmental implications of genetic engineering and industrial food. Also the author of Contamination, which chronicles investigation into the myriad synthetic chemicals we encounter in our daily lives, and so on. So he's going to talk with us today about the program that he's got going at the University of Delaware, and we're very pleased to have him with us. So.
This microphone seems like it's about the right level. So it's nice to be here. I've never been here before. I've spent a lot of time living in central New Jersey and have heard a lot about this place, kind of growing up out of the soil, it seems like. It looks like somebody planted a university and here popped up. It's amazing to see. And it sounds like you guys are getting to invent a lot of programs here, which is fun for the faculty and fun for the students to see something start from scratch. University of Delaware has been around for a long time. This program has not. I've sort of invented this thing, and people are doing this around the country. This environmental humanities subject is getting a lot of play out there, and it's most excited I've been a professor now for 23 years. It's the most excited I've been to be doing this work. It's very relevant in the time of global environmental issues. So I'm going to run, I purposely put some slides together that I hope will appeal to both students who are kind of interested in content and also faculty who are interested in actually building a program. So let's see if I can make all this cohere together. So that's the title. The humanities part is about the imagination, obviously, creation of stuff. But because it's an environmental humanities, we also have a lot of science and policy and stuff working into it. So my talk, I hope, will show you the breadth of this field, which goes everywhere from science and policy on one end to things like poetry and philosophy on the other end. So what I want to do, just because of where we are and the people in the room studying this issue from different points of view, I want you to think about what happened in this country after World War II was over. So this is news to some people, but when we experienced what went down in Europe, the whole continent was traumatized, and we were terrified about something like that ever happening in this country, getting invaded, getting taken over. So we obsessively started building infrastructure to protect us. And I don't know if you know this, but the interstate highway system was originally built as a measure of what we would now call homeland security. So just like in Germany, those big roads in the Autobahn, the interstate system was initially built to move troops and military hardware around the country. So if you look at that map down there in the lower left, that is a map of the interstate system. So you know about I-95. The odd numbers run north-south, the even numbers run east-west. And then the pictures here are what happened next, which is after you built all these highways in the 1950s and 60s, suddenly, let's start here. So we have 47,000 miles of interstate right now. That's just interstate. That's not county roads or state roads, that's interstate. What happened then is that a lot of veterans, millions of men came back from the war, and they decided they saw these bright, shiny roads, and they thought, I don't have to live in the city anymore. Maybe I can move out into what they used to call the country and build myself a house. Now, for me, I always knew this. I grew up outside of New York City, and I always knew that after the war, all these soldiers moved out to the suburbs. But what I didn't realize is there were no suburbs yet. First, they had to build the roads. So the highway system got built, and then, as the saying has been for about 60 years in the East Coast, farms don't grow food, they grow houses. So farmers started selling their land right and left, and people started building subdivisions. You see these all up and down the road right here by campus. I just saw that driving in. Now, in this place, New Jersey is an old state, right? If you go down to a place like, I don't mean old, what I mean is the suburbs here are old. Like the suburbs of Philly, the suburbs of New York, those are old. I'm talking about the suburbs that you would see like in Levittown or in like outside of Atlanta or Phoenix, these places that have popped up in the last 20 years. The suburbs of Philly, like Bryn Mawr, has been there for 300 years or something. I'm talking about the new suburbs. So just follow this line of thinking. Tens of millions of houses were built, and they were built on top of about 4 million small farms. So just like that, 4 million farms disappeared and were turned into subdivisions. So a lot of things happened because of this. I just saw this. I had to take a picture just the other day. I was in a supermarket and I saw a children's storybook called Good Night Construction Site. And I thought, that is a perfect suburban thing. I mean, because little babies go to sleep listening to the bulldozers knocking all the forests over so they can build subdivisions. So, you know, it used to be Good Night Moon, now it's Good Night Bulldozer. Anyway, I thought that was a perfect suburban story. So, think about this. So you know, the war ends, all these soldiers come back, there are all these brand new roads, people are starting to build houses out in the suburbs, and coincidentally, chemical companies, which used to sell their chemicals to the army, are now selling them to people at home. They're selling them to farmers and homeowners. Why are homeowners buying chemicals? They have these new things called lawns, which they didn't used to have when they lived in Philadelphia, but now they've got an acre out, you know, in New Jersey someplace. So all these chemical companies started to sell chemicals to all of these homeowners and farmers, things like DDT. And they're great marketing campaigns that you can listen to, these little jingles of, you know, little farm animals saying that DDT is good for me. And they, you know, ask your grandparents if they remember the DDT trucks that would go up and down suburban roads and fog the neighborhoods. This is a highly carcinogenic chemical and is now banned. So, you know, Silent Spring, anybody who studies this stuff knows about Rachel Carson. In 1962 comes out with this magazine article, which became a book called Silent Spring, talking about what anybody who studies ecology, especially watershed ecology, will understand. You have chemicals in the air, then they get into the ground, then they get into the water, then they move up the food chain through microorganisms, get into alpha, you know, top of the food chain predators, whether they're birds or fox or whatever it is, and the bioaccumulation of these chemicals is now so concentrated that you end up having real problems. Some of you may know that the bald eagle, the national symbol, was very close to extinction in the early 1960s, because what happens when DDT bioaccumulates up the food chain into a bald eagle, it affects their hormones. So when the mother lays an egg, some of you may know this story, when the mother lays the eggs and goes to sit on it, the eggshell cracks. That's how the hormone change happened with the DDT. So bald eagles and lots of other things, falcons and osprey and everybody else, all almost crashed and disappeared. We banned DDT, and then they all rebound. Now, when I go canoeing with my students down in Delaware and Maryland, they're bald eagles we see every single time we go out. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. The chemical industry, of course, has tried to destroy Rachel Carson, as any industry tries to destroy anybody who's doing investigative work about it. So anyway, let's go back to these suburbs. I promised you we're going to end up at environmental humanities, right? But we have to kind of lay out the problems so we can talk about some of the ways we talk about it. So we turned all these farms into subdivisions, and then all these people who had these houses had to fill them up with junk, right? So then you had to build Costco's and Targets and Walmarts so we could run out and buy all this stuff to fill this huge space that we now have, right? People used to live in an apartment building. Now they have a 5,000 square foot McMansion, and you got to buy, you know, 7 beds and 4 TVs and whatever, and all these stores pop up to feed that growing need. Which, you know, again, people study all these things, but try to think about how all these things come together. Consumerism, everyone always talks about how the United States is a consumer culture. This is where it started, right? This was not a consumer culture 80 years ago the way it is now, but now, you know, we basically define ourselves by the stuff we buy and the stuff we put in our house. So, I'm not going to get into this too deeply, but one of the research projects I've been working with is about all these chemicals that these companies are producing to make all these products in all these shopping malls. And it turns out that almost everything you buy, if you just look around the room. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to tell me what's made out of plastic. I'm going to say, see if you can see something that's not made out of plastic, right where we are, including, like this thing is supposed to look like wood, but it's definitely not wood. And that's the only thing that even looks like it's not made out of chemical. Right, so everything from the carpeting to the tables and chairs to the acoustic tiles to this to your clothes, some of you, most of you probably, right, so everything. Well, it turns out that those chemicals are not entirely benign, at least not all of them. They're just used to make everything we come into contact with. So it turns out that there are about 80,000 chemicals being used to create all these consumer products that we're talking about, and about 200 of them have ever been tested for any impact on human health, which looks like that on a graph. Now, you probably think, so what, I'm wearing like a, you know, a polypro, you know, fleece vest, I'm not going to get cancer from that. That's probably true. But, you know, that drinking water bottle you're drinking out of has a chemical compound known as phthalates in it, which are known endocrine disruptors. And you can test somebody before and after they drink out of a plastic bottle. We can actually quantify how much of the plastic has leaked into the water is now in your body. I mean, this is not hard to discover. It's done all the time. Now, whether those chemicals are going to cause you a problem or not is impossible to predict. But what we're talking about is just like the saturation we have with all this stuff. You know, women are particularly upset about this phenomenon. The cosmetics industry is almost entirely unregulated. The chemicals that go into these personal care products, many of them contain carcinogens and endocrine disruptors and reproductive problem, neurological disruption, all kinds of things. And nobody has to oversee them because that's the way the law is written. The EPA has given the cosmetics industry basically a pass. So you probably heard about pink washing. This is where these companies can stick little pink ribbons on them and let you think that they're supporting breast cancer research. There are actually a variety of products that have ingredients that cause breast cancer that still put the ribbon on. So that's called pink washing. That's using the ribbon to make you think one thing even if you're doing the opposite thing. So anyway, so I wrote a whole book about that petrochemical saturation we have with our consumer products. And more recently I've been working on food. It turns out when you eliminate all the farms, you also have no place to grow food. Right? So if you can't grow food, where does your food come from? And I will often start a class by asking my students, like, tell me very specifically where what you had for dinner came from. And I don't mean the supermarket. I mean, what piece of ground did it come from? And usually I get a 0% response. Unless there's like one hippie chick in the class who like grows her own mushrooms or something. Then she usually knows. But everybody else is like, I don't know, Domino's or KFC or whatever. And I'm like, exactly, this is the whole point. And the point is not to make anyone feel guilty or unhealthy, although you probably should feel both. It is basically to say that you grew up in this community. This is what your landscape looks like. You didn't invent this, you were born into it. You pop into the world and this is what it looks like. A strip with a bunch of fast food joints on it. That's how Americans have come to eat. Americans like their food fast and they like it cheap. That's the primary thing they want, fast and cheap. Doesn't matter if it's nutritious, doesn't matter if it's organic or locally grown or grass-fed. I mean, only the yuppies care about that. What most Americans care about is I want it fast and cheap. Fast and cheap. That's why the American waistline is going like this as fast as possible. Because fast and cheap does not get you a good health outcome. So the other thing we talk about is how if there are no more farms, and New Jersey is a perfect place to talk about this because the Garden State actually is an agricultural state. Always has been, still is in some places. But, you know, not the way it used to be. Because, well, it's not up there anymore. But, you know, McDonald's doesn't buy peaches from New Jersey. What does McDonald's buy? They buy corn, wheat, and soybeans from these giant industrial farms in the Midwest. Because we don't grow our food now, we have to bring our food in from somewhere else. What does that mean? It means we get processed food, fast food, what we call industrial food. So if you get in your car, and I wrote a book about this, I'll tell you about this in a second, but you get in your car in like, get in your car here and drive to Colorado, drive to Denver, and tell me what you see. And what you will see is that, right? You'll see farms, and you'll say, wow, there's so many farms in this country, but that may be true, but there are only 3 crops. There's corn, wheat, and soybeans. Everything else has disappeared. So you won't see forests, you won't see wildflowers, you won't see wild animals, and you won't really even see produce. Because Americans don't eat vegetables, they eat pizza and chicken nuggets and Coke. And we eat it 3 times a day. And that stuff is very easy to produce on these giant scale farms. It's not what's being produced in New Jersey. So those crops can make all kinds of cheap soda. Anybody know how do you make cheap soda out of corn? How does that work? All the soda that you drink is sweetened not with sugar, but with what's called high fructose corn syrup. It's a sweetener derived from industrial corn. So why is a hamburger up there? A hamburger is not a crop. Well, all the animals that we eat are fed these crops: corn, wheat, soybean, and junk food. Of course, you can make all kinds of stuff. So 40% of the grain. So we have these massive farms out in which way is? I don't even know where we are. West from here, we have 40% of our 300 million acres of commodity crops is now being used to feed the 9 billion animals that we eat every year. And we could have a conversation about industrial animal farming, which, you know, no matter what you feel about eating meat, this practice can only be called unethical, if not immoral. Like this is a moral disaster. Whether you eat meat or chicken or not, you should never have it grown like this. But this is what the system has demanded. There will come a time, in my estimation, my humble prediction, that we will look back on this way of growing food and be disgusted. I mean, like, we will think that was a terrible moment in human-animal relationships. And that's a story for another day. All this stuff is owned by about half a dozen companies. All the seeds that are used on these farms, all the chemicals that are used, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the herbicides, all controlled by about 5 or 6 different companies, many of which are now merging and becoming even bigger and fewer. So another thing that we talk about is what it means for our entire food system to be controlled by just a couple of companies that can say this or that, and entire systems, in fact, entire global systems change. Like, do we create organic food? Like, would, DuPont create massive amounts of organic food? Well, it wouldn't make any sense because then they wouldn't be able to sell their chemicals to the companies they've already sold their GMO seeds to. So the reason we don't have massive scale organic produce is because these companies have no interest in organic produce. They have an interest in selling chemicals. So that's, you get, and when you ask about like what federal farm policy is what these companies tell the government to do, because these are the companies that have the money to control politics, right? That doesn't sound too cynical, right? Like that's actually pretty like demonstrably true. So we've lost 4 million small farms. I always like to say that they were named for the things that were destroyed to make them. So, you have Westfield Farm, Chateau Woods, Carlson Farm, but there are no farms or woods anymore. There's just subdivisions with those names. So what I'm trying to figure out is, like, does this seem recognizable to you? Does it seem like a landscape that you can see out there? You spray or you put down fertilizer on your lawns, and eventually it runs down into where I live in the Chesapeake Bay. That's what Chesapeake Bay looks like in August when you have all this fertilizer running off of farms and off of people's houses. Do you guys know what algae blooms are? You guys have those up here? Like, I'm sure you do. You get any fresh water, you have a bunch of fertilizer dumped in, the algae goes crazy, lives about 24 hours, dies, and as it dies, it decomposes, it sucks all the oxygen out of the water. So if you looked under that green scum there would be nothing living under. There wouldn't be a plant or a crab or an eel or a fish, nothing. That's called a hypoxic dead zone. So that's another issue. That's another issue of poor farming practices and suburbia. These algae blooms you can see from outer space, which is a trip. So this is not just like a freshwater problem. It's a big-time marine ecology problem, too. Cutting all these trees down, eliminating all kinds of native plants to create farms and suburbs has also eliminated all kinds of species. You've probably heard about what's called bee colony collapse, like the disappearance of pollinators. And you probably noticed that monarch butterflies are in the news a lot because they're just about to blink out, as they say, blink out to extinction, because they're running at around between 2 and 4% of their normal populations. And the reason for that is that, I don't know if you've studied entomology, but butterflies basically monarch butterflies eat one plant. The caterpillar eats a plant called milkweed, which I'm sure you've heard about. That's it. They don't eat. You can't like get a little monarch caterpillar and put it in a cage and put grass in there, as little kids would do. Oh, here's something to eat. Well, the monarch will not eat that, so it'll starve. So it eats one thing. It eats It eats milkweed. The caterpillars eat the leaves, and the adults pollinate and nectar on the flowers. So if you eliminate milkweed, monarch butterflies are going to disappear. The reason that milkweed has disappeared is because it's considered a weed growing along the sides of farms that used to have lots of milkweed, but the farmers are now spraying these herbicides that kill everything except the corn, wheat, and soybeans. So the monarchs go away because the milkweed's gone away because we use the herbicides. You see what I mean? So all these things kind of link together. There's a chart of the monarch populations. We're down to, this is in 17, but we were under 3%. So, we'll get to, I promise there's good news at the end of this thing. Right now, my intent is to take you down the rabbit hole. But I want you to see how all these things are interconnected in a way that's very intimate to your actual lives. Like you guys, we all live in this kind of situation, we shop in this kind of situation, we eat like this, and these are the various threads that interconnect. But we're not quite done with the depressing stuff. So now that we've planted our whole country with GMO industrial crops, we're now pushing our seeds deep into South America. You've noticed a lot of stories recently about ongoing deforestation in the Amazon, and it's primarily to grow more corn, wheat, and soybeans. So we can feed more cattle because more people around the world are trying to eat like us, which is a really bad idea. It's one thing for 300 million Americans to eat a 16-ounce steak every other night. But if you get 1.2 million or billion Chinese or 1.2 billion Indians eating the way we do, the whole global system would just completely fall apart. Like, the only reason it hasn't fallen apart fully yet is because American consumption is, still relatively small compared to the number of people in the world. If the number of people start acting like us, then we're going to be in trouble. So the newest thing, and I'm going to wrap around to some of the more positive stuff. So now that we've cut all these different trees down, we have what are called forest fragments, little chunks of forest here and there separated by a lot of something else, a lot of farm or a lot of suburbia. And what's happening there is a real, what we call an invasion of different kinds of species from elsewhere. So you look into the forest, I don't know if you guys can, I'm sure you can do it anywhere here. Yeah, I can see it right out there. Go out into those woods and look at the trees. And presumably, at least some of those are native trees, or maple trees and oak trees and whatever. But they're also being completely overrun by these invasive, most visibly vines. So I can see straight through that window, there's something called Japanese honeysuckle that looks like this. It'll grow up, it'll either strangle the tree or it'll go up and blow out its leaves up in the canopy and starve the tree of any kind of photosynthesis. So you go out in some woods where I am in the mid-Atlantic, and like 100% of the trees are being overgrown by these invasives, like Japanese honeysuckle, something called Oriental bittersweet. It's a very thick vine that you'll see growing up trees. Little shrubs. This Japanese barberry you can buy in many like Home Depots, and people plant it in their yard, and then when it has fruit on it, the birds take it and go drop it in the woods, and now you've got this whole kind of infestation of barberry. Multiflora rose, Japanese silkgrass, wavy leaf basket, all these different plants. My colleagues in forestry say that the typical mid-Atlantic forest, it's like 30% of the biomass is invasive. 30%. So when you look at a forest, 30% of what you're looking at is not kind of functioning properly in that system. So our forests are in real trouble. All kinds of different things to look at. Oh, here's a quick, so this is what milkweed looks like. And this is what a monarch caterpillar looks like when it's eating the leaf, which, as I said, is the only thing it'll eat. So if you want to do something good or fun or beneficial, go back home and ask your parents to plant some milkweed in their garden. You will find that you'll have monarch butterflies like in a year. It's amazing. I don't know where they come from, but they find the milkweed and they'll show up and help out a little bit. So those are the problems. That's 25 minutes worth of problems. Now I'll give you like a few minutes worth of solutions. So, I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person that actually literally lies in bed awake at night worrying about this stuff. Right? I guess you got to worry about something. That's what I just worry about, like ecological apocalypse. That's my thing. Everybody's got a thing. That's mine. So, I was trained. I'm both a journalist and an English professor. I'm like, like, what am I supposed to do? Write some pretty, essay about the environment? Is that going to do anything? Is that worth doing? Once you are hip to this stuff? It's like once you're hip to racism or once you're hip to sexual harassment, like you got to decide what you're going to do, because you can't do everything. You can't fix the whole thing. All you can do is like take a little bite, try to do what you can do. So I'm not a trained scientist. I just hang out. I just play one on TV. And I try to hang out with as many scientists as I can. But I've got some stuff that I can do too. So the first thing I did is I started writing books. Like my first thing, as any writer does, like, well, what am I going to do to contribute what I know? So I wrote a book about, as I mentioned, about toxics that has a personal narrative, because I had a cancer scare a few years ago and I was asked all these questions about these chemicals that I've been exposed to. I was like, what are you talking about? I've been an English professor and a journalist. Like, no, I'm talking about all the stuff that everybody comes into contact with. So this whole story, this whole book is built on like a first-person experience with all the stuff that I was talking about. And then I wrote a book about the EPA with this guy who used to work inside the EPA for like 30 years. And he pulled out all these documents, and we kind of did this whistleblower book about how these companies, like the big chemical companies and the EPA, which is supposed to be overseeing them, are actually like totally in bed together, and always have been. Are terribly in bed at the moment, but have always been, somewhere in bed. And then most recently, I had this book about GMOs. Is all about that food stuff, all about the industrial food, the disappearance of local food, all that. These are all narrative. This is all narrative environmental journalism. This is not hard science. This is very accessible, written with all the kind of journalistic technique. So I did that, and then I said, well, that's fine, but I don't know if this is you're aware of this, but it's like environmental science books do not sell like the Da Vinci Code. You know, it's like, and I only say that because I don't know if you know what the Da Vinci Code, but it's written by this guy named Dan Brown. He sold like 500 million copies of it or something. I went to college with that guy. I like sang the Glee Club with that guy. His books and my books are often in the same bookstore at the same time. And I will often ask the bookstore, like, so, how's my book doing? And then I'll say, well, how's Dan Brown's book doing? And she's like, well, you sold like one book in the last 6 years, and Dan sold like 7 books in the last 30 seconds. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is like there are other things to do besides trying to write books, because it turns out that a lot of Americans don't read books. I don't know if you're aware of that, but like, you go, hey, I wrote a new book. They're like, thanks, you know, why don't you go make me a hula hoop or something like that, something useful. So anyway, I did that for a while, and then I said, well, let's do something else. Let's try to start some programmatic stuff at the university so we can get more people. Like, it's not that helpful to teach a course in environmental literature or something and have a bunch of hippie kids show up, because they're going to be there anyway. What I need to do is to figure out a way to get more people into the room, both more students and more colleagues across more disciplines, so we could all have a conversation. I also personally got certified as a Maryland Master Naturalist, which is a program to teach all this kind of environmental science, and now I'm actually starting a program like this in Delaware to do more kind of community environmental education. So the humanities thing I bring to the classroom is, you know, based on trying to find not just the problems, which I have spent a lot of time trying to write about, but also where the wisdom is that can help us get out of these issues. So in my classes, we read a lot of stuff. We read ecology, of course, Aldo Leopold. Anybody who does this stuff knows about Aldo Leopold, writing about what he calls a land ethic. Like, you know, ethics are not just like, I agree not to hit you and you agree not to hit me. Like, that's an ethical relationship between two people. But, you know, between a person and the land, you know, a human being could have a more ethical relationship with the landscape by saying, I won't do anything, it's going to damage the system. That would be an ethical relationship, and we don't really have a particularly ethical relationship right now. So I'm just going to flash up a couple of book titles. Bringing Nature Home is a fabulous book written by this colleague of mine about the benefits of planting native plants in your yard. I really strongly recommend it. I teach quite a bit of indigenous Native American literature and philosophy, trying to understand what a non-capitalist system would have looked like on the land. You know, we've kind of lost sight of the fact that this isn't the way it had to be. This is the way it has become. But it's certain systems that end up with land use like we have. I teach my students meditation. We study a lot of Buddhist writing in that class. Again, trying to find alternative approaches, like what does nature mean to a non-Christian or a non-capitalist or a non-Westerner? There turn out to be many different ways of engaging with the world. And my favorite of all probably is Taoism, which is a philosophical tradition out of China that actually recommends that people realize that there is wisdom that is not even human. It's non-human wisdom. So one of the most famous lines in that text is called, "The best way to live is to be like water, for water benefits all things and goes against none of them." What would it mean to model your life? What would it mean to even conceive of modeling your life off of something that isn't actually talking to you? Like, could you learn something from a tree or a mountain or a river? And of course, if you scoff at that, you should be aware that that scoffing is like unique in human history. Like, except for us, everybody knew that all stuff to be true. But we are so gapped, so distant from any of that, that like it wouldn't even conceive of you to find solace in a forest or something like that. All of the people have known this to be true. So this is a weird thing, but I don't know if you've heard of this book called The Forest Unseen. This guy, David George Haskell, wrote a great book. He basically threw like a hula hoop down in the middle of the woods in Tennessee and just wrote a book about what's going on in an ecosystem that's even that small. And he talks about this metaphor of the mandala, which is a Tibetan bit of sacred Buddhist meditation practice, where they make these beautiful designs out of individual grains of colored sand. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that, but it can take, 4 monks a week to make something like that. And then what he's doing here is he's sweeping it away. They make this beautiful thing, and then at the end they sweep it away to remind you of what they call impermanence, which is like, this is beautiful and it's here and gone, just like you. Here you are, the next day you're gone, right? That's the whole Buddhist idea of like trying to be aware of much larger things going on. So I was out actually behind my house, and I saw this is the top of an old stump. And I just finished talking about the model with my students. I thought, yeah, there it is. There's some just crazy beauty. This is this little stump right next to a dumpster in this parking lot behind my house. I was like, that's what he's talking about. So I also take English majors out to farms because, as I like to joke, one time I asked a student where potatoes come from, and he said, on a tree. And I thought, this guy needs to get outside more. So potatoes grow in the ground, you're aware of that, right? So like I take them out there and I say, look, here's a potato. We dig one out and there's some, some girl in the class is like, oh, it's dirt, got dirt on it. I'm like, it's hard to know what to say, So my goal is to get people's hands dirty in English classes if possible. That was Take Your Daughter to Work Day. So that's my daughter. She was like in 6th grade back then, holding a chicken. I'm sure I know there are local farmers around here. You should give them your money, not Chick-fil-A. And if you're looking for projects around here, either as students or faculty, leaning, I don't know how it is here yet, but leaning on the institution to invest some of its money, like fill your dining halls with locally grown produce somehow would be a worthy project. I've been working on this at Delaware for a number of years. Like what would happen if this university was to give $1 million to a farmer who is trying to hang on down the road, instead of letting him, or instead of encouraging him to sell his land to another real estate developer? Like you kind of want your farmer to be the richest people in town, because if they go away, food goes away, and if they go away, you lose your open space and you get another shopping mall. So I also, as I mentioned before, I take my students canoeing every semester. We just were on this is the Susquehanna River down in Maryland and Pennsylvania. It turns out to be one of the oldest rivers in the world. It was a river before Pangea broke up, which I totally don't even understand, but it was one continent and there was already a river, and then the continent separated and it remained a river, and I don't know how that happened, but it did. That's what the Susquehanna River is coming down at. You see that coming down out of New York into Pennsylvania, and then it basically becomes, right there, it turns the corner and becomes the Chesapeake Bay. And if you look at it from a satellite, you can actually see the ancient river corridor running straight down the middle of the Chesapeake. So the Chesapeake really is the Susquehanna River. So we spend a lot of time out there looking at stuff. These are English classes, remember. I've also been working with a group that gets churches and synagogues and mosques and all these religious institutions to get together and take a role themselves in this kind of restoration. The last couple of weeks I've been part of a group that has planted about 130 trees on like church or synagogue property. It was just yesterday planted 30 trees at a synagogue up near Baltimore. The idea is that everybody needs to take responsibility. Everybody. It's not a problem that is limited to like environmental scientists. And then lastly, I was mentioning the invasive species thing. So I've recently started this thing, which it's all it would fit on the chalkboard, but an invasive species project where I take my students out into the woods. I bought this old like plastic toolbox and put a bike lock around it, chained it to a tree, and filled it with all these tools. And so we go out there a little bit, a couple times a semester, and my students can go out there anytime they want. They got the combination, and I teach them how to identify these invasive plants and take them out. So that's how this is, again, these are English majors, but they're going into the woods, they're looking at these vines, they're doing something about it. And the idea was, they all go in the woods all the time to run or ride their bikes or hike or whatever they really enjoy. And I said, well, now it's time to actually give something back to the woods. Like, be in relationship with the woods, don't just use the woods. It becomes this way of nurturing a mutual, I don't want to say mutual, a humble and respectful and grateful relationship with the woods rather than like a using relationship. Like, they're the woods, you enjoy them. If you or if human beings don't deal with these invasive plants, nothing else will, because there are no bugs that eat it, there are no birds that eat it. I mean, it's just like it's a disaster and it needs human intervention, so that's what we're looking for. I always joke that if you could design, like if you could genetically engineer a deer to only eat invasive plants, that would like solve all the problems, because the deer go out now and they eat all the native plants, and all these invasives just go bananas. But anyway, if people don't do this, then nobody will, so it's really kind of our responsibility. This is what it looks like. That's an Oriental bittersweet vine. climbing up a tree, it'll get up there and choke this tree, and then that tree comes down, and it goes and finds another tree and pulls that down. It's really kind of an astonishing thing to become aware of. So the message for me and my students is that, in order if the goal is to heal a place, you got to learn to love it, and before you can love it, you got to actually be exposed to it and learn about it. So I try to work that backwards and take people out and have them have experiences with these places, so they can learn to love them. Once they love them, they can invest in them, and they can try to take care of it. So that's what I had to say in 38 minutes. So thank you very much. If anybody has questions of any kind or review.
Okay, so just from knowing a lot of the people in this room, I know a majority of us are actually engineers, and we're kind of getting into a point where, like, a large part of your presentation was talking about how, like, the system that we have in place now for our food systems, our chemical companies, it's a completely broken system. I completely agree, but like, us as engineers are going to be the people that can kind of change that system. And so how would you recommend us getting a better education as a school? Because we don't really have any environmental ethics courses for us.
Well, you just answered your own question. I think my feeling, and I mean, it's not just here that's like that. Take your field, chemical engineering, so you can make new Coke bottles, or genetic engineering so you can grow new kinds of GMO soybeans, or whatever it is. Regardless of what training you get in engineering or biotech or whatever it is, you're never getting exposed to the possible consequences of your work. So if you go and learn how to make a perfectly awesome GMO, that is a successful outcome. If you were on your way to creating this awesome GMO and then you took an ethics class and someone said, do you realize that your new seed is going to be scaled up and planted on 200 million acres in Brazil, and in order to do that, they're going to have to take the whole rainforest down. Like, are you hip to the non-professional, non-self-serving consequences of your behavior? And the answer is that no, nobody has ever asked to take those courses for obvious reason. I mean, you do start to sound cynical. Like, you don't want to introduce those questions because then you're going to have all these like neurotic engineers that used to be just like, going to go build something, and I'm like, gee, if I build this, then this could happen. Or I'm a structural engineer. I'm going to go build a new hydroelectric dam across a river in Africa, which is they're doing like crazy. The Chinese are over there doing like crazy. So it will generate hydroelectric power, and it will also like massively change every ecosystem that it comes into contact with. Do you want your engineers thinking about that, or is that going to become a painful distraction, or something that's going to like say, well, geez, maybe I shouldn't build the dam? So these are really important questions. And I will tell you, as someone inside a university sausage factory, I think it is unethical institutionally to have kids go through their training and never get exposed to stuff, whether they're engineers or whether they're business students. I had a kid in one of my classes one time who said, we had just finished talking about what are they called? I can't remember what the name is escaping me, but they're unintended downstream consequences of a decision. Externalized costs, that's what I'm trying to remember. An externalized cost. So an externalized cost is like, you're McDonald's, and you sell 1 billion hamburgers a week, and then people eat more and more McDonald's, and they get more and more obese, and they get more and more diabetic, and then they have a whole lifetime of diabetes medication. McDonald's will never pay for that. Well, the McDonald's, in some fairly direct way, was a contributor to that. So that's an unintended consequence they don't want to pay for. Other things are like, we'll create an industry and it'll create all this pollution, and then we'll get somebody else to clean it up. We'll get the EPA to clean it up, or the state to clean it up, but we won't clean it up. So that's an externalized cost. That's a cost that we, the company, don't have to deal with. So we were talking about all these things, all these ethics in this one class, and then a girl raised her hand and said, it's funny, I just came from a business school class where they were teaching us how to externalize costs. Like how to create stuff and not have to pay to clean it up. They were teaching them how to do that. And I thought, okay, so here's a kid who's going to a university, and they're getting taught this over there and the opposite of that over here. In fact, like, in my opinion, they're being taught a bad behavior and how to get away with it, rather than the ethics of what that would mean. So I don't think that's cool. Like I don't know what that means, because no business professor wants to hear me tell them what to teach. Fair enough. Oh, by the way, she was doing that externalized cost as like a case study for Dunkin' Donuts. I forgot that was an important part of that story. Like she was trying to teach or create a plan for Dunkin' Donuts not to have to pay for the consequences of the food that they make. So I'm sure that like in a marketing world or a business world, that makes sense to teach people that. But in an ethical sense or anything outside of the business, to me, it's not cool. I don't like that. Other questions? Yeah.
So, I mean, do you really think that one person making a decision to do something ethical can make like an actual difference? Just because as engineers, like, if you're working on a project and you do tell your boss like you're not comfortable continuing with it, they'll probably fire you, and then they'll get somebody else to do it instead. It's like, so do you really think? Have you ever seen anybody stand up to the system and actually do anything?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, that's a really great question, and it goes way beyond engineers. I mean, that you're asking like a social change question, whether you mean like social change based on like civil rights or women's rights or gay rights, I mean, all that kind of stuff. And then even within the climate of a business, like, or a government agent. I mean, I know very specifically about like the EPA, where you can. I'll just give you this as an example. So the EPA, like all federal agencies, has like a very clear glass ceiling between staff, like science and policy people, and then from the top are the political appointees. So the president gets to appoint the director of the EPA, just like he gets to appoint the secretary of agriculture. Like the president appoints them, then they appoint these people, and there's this like political layer, right? So let's say you work at the EPA, and you're a chemist, and you're studying, like there's this company that wants to release a new insecticide, let's say. And they say, we need EPA approval to get this insecticide on the market. So you're the scientist at the EPA, and you're like, you're doing all these studies on rats or whatever it is. You find out that this is like a massive carcinogenic problem. So you tell your boss, well, I did the research on that chemical, and it turns out it causes cancer in everything that it touches. And we're not going to give the green light to DuPont, Dow, Monsanto, Syngenta, whoever it is. We're not going to approve this thing. So you tell your boss, and he tells their boss, and they tell their boss, and then it hits the political layer. And the political layer is, in that case, that guy's actual office. He used to work for Dow Chemical. But he took it, when the new administration came in, he took a job in the EPA. Right? So all these federal agencies are actually staffed by former industry people at the political level. So you've done your work as a scientist, and you're like, well, I've really saved a lot of lives here because I'm going to halt the production of this chemical. So you tell your boss, and then it hits the political level. And the political guy used to work for that company, or his boss used to work for that company. They're like, actually, thanks, but we're going to bury that research, and we're going to approve that pesticide is going to go out on the market. This happens a lot more than you might imagine. So you, the ethical scientist, get to do your ethical work, and then you put it into the system, and it percolates, and then it hits these other realities like politics and money and all that. Because, let's say that chemical gets produced, and now they sell it. They make $50 million a week selling this chemical, and then you're like, actually, it's carcinogenic. Like, there's no way the company is going to want that to happen. These are very profitable enterprises. So, whatever, you guys, you're about to enter this working world. Ethics is a part of your daily life. I mean, I hate to say it, and it's not always so dramatic as like, do this or you get fired, but you're going to have millions of opportunities to make these decisions on micro and macro levels for the rest of your life. And if you're an engineer, maybe bigger than others, because can you build another nuclear plant, or do you want to build a better way to get coal out of Appalachia? You might say, I don't want to do that. Like, we're done with that. And then maybe you figure out maybe this industry isn't for me or something. It's not easy. It's not. I don't envy it. I mean, it's something you all have to deal with. And as consumers, of course, too, not just as employees, but like, what are you going to eat tonight? What kind of car are you going to drive? What kind of landscape are you going to have at your house? Are you going to plant native plant? I mean, every decision you make every day is full of ethical implications, as long as you know them. So this is where professors come in. Like the problem is not that people are educated and act poorly. I mean, some do. But a bigger problem is the fact that people's general ecological knowledge is basically non-existent. So it's hard to tell somebody that the way you buy your food is contributing to the decline of pollinating bees and monarchs, because they're like, I don't get it, I'm just buying Oreos. Like, they don't see the, you know what I mean? So it is incumbent on all of us to kind of like up the general level. And this is where environmental humanities can really be helpful, I think, because it gets non-science people to think about science a little bit, which most of us are terrified by. And it brings some of the ethical things to the science and the engineers who otherwise never have to deal with that. They just make stuff or they blow stuff up or whatever. Other questions? Yeah.
How do you like provide education to essentially like people who aren't in education, like us as students, if we kind of have opportunities to learn about like ecological and many like the environmental impacts of these things, but like people who are in the workforce right now, the people don't really have an opportunity to like learn about these things or care to learn about these things. Like, how do you bring that education to them?
Well, if you're asking me what I'm doing, I can tell you, and then I will just use that as a model. So I mentioned that I got trained as a master naturalist. I did this like 6 months ago, so this is not part of academic work, but it's 60 hours of classroom training and then 50 hours of volunteer work, which I did in a forest. And then when I got certified, that was through the state of Maryland where I live, and I then went to the state of Delaware where I work, and I was like, what's the master naturalist program like here? And they said, the state said, we don't have one. So there is not a way to do this. So I'm starting one. So I'm starting a statewide master naturalist training program basically to do exactly that, which is to try to train several hundred really environmentally aware and knowledgeable citizens, not necessarily college kids, but anybody, so that they can then become ecological restoration workers in the woods, in the rivers, wherever, like reconstituting some of these environments. So what am I doing? What I'm trying to do, in addition to my university work, is to do public outreach education to do exactly that. What do? You go work for an engineering firm with a sense of ethics, and you bring that to the table. Like once you have a sense of this stuff, I hate to say it, but you can't like unsee it. You can't unknow it. Like you can no longer. It's like once you've seen what a slaughterhouse is like, you may still choose to eat burgers, but you can no longer eat a burger and be happy about it. It's like, I know, God, I know I'm eating this horrifying thing, but I still can't stop eating burgers. You know what I mean? So like you got to take whatever you got and bring it to wherever you are. And if you're working in a firm, or if you're working in a firm and everybody already knows this stuff, then what you do is you take your energy and put it this way. A friend of mine said the other day, he's like talking about civil rights work in Baltimore and stuff. He's like, you don't want to go where the work is being done. You want to go where the work needs to be done. This is why I like teaching tree huggers is not moving the needle at all, because they're already there. What I want to do is encourage people to talk to people who aren't already drinking the food. Other thoughts?
Environmental science covers a lot of things, including like renewable energy, but sometimes the renewable energy sources can cause problems to the environment, like turbines killing birds and things like that. And how, like, would you compare that to some of the farming things? Because they're all good in some ways and all bad in their own ways as well. And like, how would you compare the different environmental impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like, if you're asking like what should we focus on most, like what are the really bad things we got to go after first, and what things are just not, like, is a wind turbine killing birds a reason not to have wind turbines? And I would say, knowing that what I'm going to say is complicated, I think it's worth having wind turbines. Like, I think climate change is worse than, I don't know. The number of birds that are killed by this is actually pretty high, I think. But, so there's an ethical conundrum. Like, what do you do about that? I think, it's like the risk-benefit, I guess, if you want to say. But to me,
but just comparing different uses of land and how some of the energy sources.
I know. So, like, we were talking at lunch about hydroelectric power, right? So you build a dam across the river, and the force of the water turns the turbines, which creates electricity. It creates no CO2, right? It is a carbon-neutral power source. So why don't we just dam all the rivers and get all our power from hydropower? Well, it also does terrible damage to every ecosystem it touches. It screws up indigenous fishing rights if you're in the Northwest. It screws up fish migrations on the East Coast. So it's not. So we're not doing it. In fact, we're not really building hydro dams much anymore. They kind of quit doing that. So I'm not saying I have any answers. All I'm here to do is like ask the questions. And I think that at least is worth something because way too few people even bother to ask the questions. And we were talking earlier today, you know, that's all fine and good until systems start to collapse. Like you can happily eat McDonald's and sit and play Xbox in your giant house on your 10 acres of manicured, pesticide-laden lawn, and do that for a certain number of years until you realize that, I'm talking about we, scaled up to system size. You know, you can do that until the climate collapses or the ecology collapses or the soil collapses or water quality collapses. Something is going to, all the trends are saying that this stuff is not in any way manageable over the long run. So you can keep putting your head in the sand until, you know, how many hurricanes is it going to take before Miami actually literally disappears into the ocean? It will happen, you know, within your lifetimes. Miami will just like, unless I don't know what they're going to do, build. Maybe that's where Trump can build his wall, you know, build your wall around Miami. How long is it going to be before Manhattan is underwater? And then people are like, geez, there's this thing called sea level rise. What's that? Where does that happen? And by then, you know, it's like the horse has left the barn. And I'm sure you guys have spent some time talking about this UN report that came out a couple weeks ago. This is no joke, and it's also coming way faster than we thought. You know, between 12 and like 40 years, like well within your lifetime. So, not saying I'm activist or, you know, this is, you gotta be a part of this. There's just like no excuse. There's no excuse not to be a part of this.
I'm kind of piggybacking off of what she said, and what you said. There's a balance between remembering stuff and also using new stuff. One example is the internet has changed our lives so much that, and there are ways that all of these either new technologies or remembering old technologies are how they interact and the benefits and costs of them. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that as a question because I happen to have a brother who, like many people in the tech world, is 100% convinced that technology will solve every problem that will ever happen. Climate change, technology, fixes food problems. I mean, it's all about like building a better app. Like he's like evangelical about this. Like he cannot be compromised in this opinion. And the response to that typically is that every new technology is invented to take care of the problems of the previous technology. So the reason that tech people like to say that, of course, also is because as long as that thing keeps happening, they get to keep their jobs and keep making the better and better iPhone. I don't even want to open up this can of worms, but I'm glad you phrased the question the way you did because a lot of people will say, you said the internet has changed our lives. You didn't say that the internet has improved our lives. Most people will say that it's improved our lives because now you can shop anywhere you want, anytime you want. Like that's all they want, and now they got it, right? Right? What's the internet mainly used for? Shopping and pornography. I hate to break this to you, but like if you look at the actual number of man-hours, that is the right use of it. Well, the number of hours you spend on the internet basically for those two things. So that's what it's. I mean, congratulations, you created this awesome thing. That's what you got. You can shop for shoes or look at porn. That's a side issue. But you know, the research is coming out now about what the internet has done to people's social dysfunction and how isolated people are getting. They can't even talk to you anymore. I know my journalists no longer feel comfortable interviewing people face to face. What they want to do is FaceTime them. They want to email them or text them. They don't want to be in an actual room with an actual person because the interface of this technology. So anyway, the technology has created some things and it's created other things. Some of them are good, some are bad, some are we think are good and are turning out not to be so good. You know, the whole can of worms. Is it going to save us? I mean, I don't know. You build me an app that's going to get rid of those invasive plants, or build me an app that's going to get rid of the CO2 up there. You know, I think we got to focus much more on our relationship with this, our obsession with it, our obsession with shopping for it and stuff. Is other ideas or thoughts? Any of you all, students or faculty, want to talk about like, programs? Like when you were asking about like taking an engineering class, but also taking a required ethics class. Can you talk about that?
I'll ask a question that leads into that. One word that you used that really struck me was wisdom. And that's not a word we actually use in the academic sphere much anymore, but probably is one that we really should. And so I was curious, when you're developing these courses or these, whatever it is you're doing, as you said, you want to reach people who aren't already interested in these things, or an English class that's out in the woods, et cetera. And the focus is on wisdom. Like, what does that look like for an engineering or biology student? What is it that humanities brings to that? How do they react to that idea?
Well, I'll tell you how I came to this conclusion first. So one of my best friends at the university is the guy who teaches world religions. So I don't know if you must have something like that here. Like, you take his intro class and you learn about Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and, shamanism and all that stuff. And his class, he's a great teacher, but his classes are so freaking popular, in my opinion, because students are desperately hungry for, what do you want to call that, a spiritual component, not to their academic training, but to their lives. Like people, because, the corollary to all this, and the reason that the wisdom stuff is in there is because suburbia and consumers and all this has vacuumed out a spiritual life for most people. I'm not saying religious, I'm being careful here. I'm not saying you need to be a Catholic, right? I'm saying that there is I hope I don't sound too but I actually really believe that students and maybe everybody else has just sort of woken up and realized that they've got a spiritually empty or spiritually partially full existence. So the reason I say that is because students flock by the hundreds to take these courses where they learn about typically contemplative religious traditions like Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, something that people are really, their lives are really much richer spiritually than they are here. And so I thought, wow. And so I signed up 15 years ago. I was already a tenured professor. I went and sat in on his undergrad class for a whole semester. I just audited his class. I was I want to just absorb what this guy's doing. And kids were rapt. When he started talking about why is it that you think you are the way you are? The big philosophical questions philosophy departments always do. Who are you and why are you and what are we doing here and what happens after we die? All that stuff. Turns out people are a little interested in that. Everybody is always interested in that, but nobody's asking those questions anymore. Everything's got sort of anyway, so the wisdom stuff comes in my view, through the environmental humanities by adding this other thing, which is that not only do you as a human being always have questions about who you are, why you are, what happens next, where were you, as the Zen Buddhists say, where were you before your parents were born? Think about that for 6 months and come and talk to me, that stuff? It was whoa, God, wow, reincarnation, wow. So, it turns out that there's also this thing within the environment. People are, if you listen to E.O. Wilson or whoever, people are what do you want to say, organically or in their cellular or reptile brain or whatever you want to say, we are, what should we say, forest dwellers, or we live on the land. We always have lived on the land. Here, I'll give you a good number. So let's say human beings have been around for 24 hours on a 24-hour clock. How long have we been farming at all? And I don't mean industrial farming, farming at all. So about 6 minutes on a 24-hour clock. So we were hunter-gatherers for 23 hours and 54 minutes. And then 10,000 years ago, we started planting stuff and then ripping up and planting it. This is a whole other story, but we planted annual crops. We became an agricultural species. And everything changed after that. This suburbia stuff is just the latest thing. But we became agricultural people for the first time in all the history of our species, and the whole world changed because of that. So these questions, I've been hanging out with teenagers for a long time, and teenagers in college, and now I've got two of my own. But the questions that people want to ask, this is where the humanities has something to offer. An engineer asks big questions, but they're not that big. They're not existence kind of questions. Because they're practical people, This impractical stuff is taught in English departments and philosophy departments and places like that. But it turns out it's not just philosophy people that care about these questions. So that's how I come at it. I come at it, it's what are you interested in at a very deep level? Not just what kind of job are you going to get, but how do I want to be in the world? And that's where you get to bring some of these other things, ethical questions, spiritual questions, literary questions, behavioral questions, all that stuff. That's all the humanities. That's the nice thing. That's what science and tech and science and policy people are not bringing. That's what the humanities. You meet halfway, and then you can have a really good conversation. And then you get the outcomes are you get ethical engineers, but then you get English majors who actually know what's going on in the world. Like, you know, I say this as an English professor with a PhD in English. They don't know squat. They think they do because they're like really awesome at reading books and telling you like really cool things about books that like you normal people would never think anyone cared about. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if you've ever taken a literary theory class, but it'll blow your mind, partially by how smart it is, but also by how like weird it is. It's like, that's how you want it? Anyway, so they also, like, they couldn't go into, I'm speaking now, this has nothing to do with this place, this has to do with English people that I have known. You take them in the woods and say, is that an oak tree or a maple tree? And they won't have any idea. So the way we talk about it in the environmental humanities is that's called being displaced. Like you're here, but you could be in San Diego or in Maine, and you wouldn't even know because your head is in the book. So the environmental humanities thing, I'm really being sarcastic now, I apologize, but like part of it is to get these book people out into the world. Go look at the actual world, not only the one in the text. So that's, I don't know. I will admit to like a kind of a physicality with this. Like I really think that being outside and actually in some cases doing work is a really important part of all this. So, because you know the environment just doesn't just need us to think about it. You know, that's what I mean. The forest project is the most obvious. Like it's all well and good to think about. Oh my God, pollinators are crashing everywhere. It's nothing to go into the woods and look at those vines and don't just say, wow, that's a bummer, but to actually get rid of the vines. Like, do it, because no one else is going to do it. And if you don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. And you can take that on any issue that you want to talk about. It's not just thinking about it. We actually got to engage. It's like, don't just think about racism. Like, do something. Like, stop being a racist, or stop voting for them, or electing them, or whatever. We got 1 week to go. Other questions? Hopefully.
Maybe we can just have the three of us that were panelists, since we're all here already.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I had a question. Well, one thing that was said, your question, sir. We don't have those sorts of classes on campus. We do. We have a whole bachelor's degree in environmental studies that features environmental ethics. This is not just correcting you, but you know, anyway. So we have a degree in environmental and sustainability studies. We also have a minor that's just 6 credits, half of which you've already taken in the course of being engineers. So it's 3 or so more classes to complete the minor in environmental studies. And then as of this fall, we have a small certificate program that's 4 classes specifically in environmental humanities. So if you enjoyed Dr. Jenkins' talk today, you may like to also see the selection of classes that we have that are open to all students on campus that are classes about exactly this type of thing. Some of them are philosophy classes. There's a new one in religion. You mentioned this religious component being taught by faculty in the philosophy and religion department that's called Spirituality and Nature. That's going to be offered for the first time in the spring. And then some other, Dr. Crowley has a class on environmental literature, among others. So there are things that we're trying to start, you know, to address your question and concern of how do people learn about this. Well, we're trying to make that a thing that, you know, can be explored a little bit more. And yeah, so I wanted to add that to the room right now. And I had a question for you. I pretend to be a humanist, but I'm not very good at the humanities. I'm more into like the kind of policy dimensions of environmental issues. And so one thing that I always wonder, what do humanists say about this? Is there a limit to what markets can accomplish environmentally? So your talk focused on the negative impacts of a capitalist market economy. Is there a limit to what markets could accomplish on the positive end for the environment?
So like a carbon tax kind of thing, or
any sort of market-based instrument that's frequently suggested as something that could get us out of this mess. Does that seem plausible to you, or is there a limit to what markets can do?
well, so I'm going to be a really obnoxious humanities person and answer that like with an abstraction kind of.
Okay.
Because I mean, you got to start asking, like, what are markets, and how do markets function, and who benefits from them, and why? Like, why is it that we don't have a carbon tax right now? Why don't we have a pollution diet on chicken farmers? Why don't we have GMO chemical companies be legally required to think about downstream? Like why is the system the way it is? So when you ask, can the system like right itself? I mean, I hate to keep doing this, but this is so, these two things seem to happen right next to each other all the time. It's the same question. It's like, why is this country racist? Like, let's not even ask the question of whether it's racist. Let's just say it's racist. Why is that? When you look at deep structures of slavery and like Native American genocide, like those two things are at the root of this country. Now, whether you like to think about that or not, that is a root foundational part of the culture. So why are we racist? Because we haven't dealt with that. So, like, I don't mean to like take your question and answer a different question, but like the structural stuff about behavior and psychology and how, like, why is it that here's somebody who lives in house A and here's somebody who lives in house B, and what they do is they spend all their time looking out each other's windows to see whose lawn looks better, right? The American dream is to have a house with a lawn. The lawn is it has no more ecological value than this carpet, right? It does not absorb water, it does not support native species, it's carbon intensive because you got to mow it and fertilize. It's a total terrible idea. But we've evolved so that, you know, suburban homeowner A and suburban B are like, they have all this anxiety about their freaking lawn. It's like, just tear up your lawn and plant some native plants and don't worry about it. So like, if you say, can we like come up with an organic herbicide so people can spray their, whatever it is they're worried about, clover, and not poison the water? Well, that's a question. Maybe that's an engineering question. But a better question is like, why do you want a lawn? And what led us, you know, the lawn is this weird like Victorian British thing. Like here we spent all this time trying to get independent from the British, and now we've made our whole landscape look like a freaking British, you know, garden. Why? Like why wouldn't you want an American garden to look like a North American landscape? None of the grass that's planted here in any of your houses is from North America. It's from, you know, typically places like Africa or from the Middle East. Anyway, so what we do in my class is we try to ask these questions at a deep structural level and also at a geographic level, like focus super tight on the small watershed. Like a lot of us have spent a lot of time worrying about these big global trends and forgetting that we live in an actual place with actual rivers and actual forests and actual species collapses. And so let's take a tight look at that and see how that's functioning too. So can markets help? I guess if you took, I was going to say, if you took the profit motive or selfishness out of the equation, then the answer would be obviously yes. But if you take selfishness and profit motive, maybe there is no such thing as a market. I mean, I don't even know. I don't know. I think at some level, sure. If you could come up with a carbon tax, why don't we have a carbon tax? Because there are gargantuan industries that don't want to have a carbon tax. That's why we don't have one, not because it's not a good idea, but because there are people that would have a terrible profit loss if you had that put in place. Why are we still burning coal power? It's not because it makes any sense for anybody, but, you know, it's just whatever. It's a human political behavioral thing where it's just like, sometimes bad stuff happens because people profit from it. And things don't change, you know. Things change when the people, this is very cliche thing to say, but you know, things change when the number of people trumps, to use a terrible word, trumps financial power. Like when the people want something to change, you know, money has power until people power, like democracy movements move to a position of superior power. So, and the reverse happens too. Once people get like disinterested, the money thing gets out of, you know, gets much more control. So, I don't know if this is very saying, but like the whole Me Too thing, this just reminds me, like, why is it that big CEOs and media moguls were able to like rape and sexually abuse women for decades and decades and decades and decades? Because they all had the power. And once, you know, if you take one for the team, the journalism community, the New Yorker, the New York Times, when they started blowing the whistle on all these sexual harassment cases, and these big guys started to tumble, suddenly they realized they were no longer outside the reach of the law. Now, God willing, women will continue to rise in like power within corporations and in politics, because if you have women in power, these guys don't get away with that, because laws are written to make it very unattractive to behave like that. That, you know, the Me Too sexual harassment thing is also, you know, historically grounded in power dynamics. So I'm way far afield, but these things are all, this is the way humanities people think. Like if you start talking about this, it sounds a lot like that, and it turns out that a lot of these things have roots that are actually maybe the same. Did you know, by the way, that why did we even have slavery? We didn't have slavery because we were racist to begin with. We had slavery because white people didn't want to do the work. It was just a matter of getting other people to do the work. And you wanted not to do the work so bad that you went over and pulled a whole culture out of one place and stuck them down in another place to do the work. And then you had to become racist to make yourself be able to sleep at night. Right? Well, that person's doing my work, but at least I'm like racially superior to them. So you start creating all these mythologies of race to support your economic system that was bankrupt from the beginning. So you ask a humanity guy to start riffing and start going all over the place. Sorry.
That was a really interesting answer, and I enjoyed hearing those connections. Is there a comparison between creating racism as a structure to justify this labor model that you described, slavery, and saying that we can use markets to fix environmental problems? Is there a parallel there? Is that the same type of
I'm trying to figure out, is behind your question a suspicion that creating markets will not work? Is that
No, I am unique in the world of environmental studies a lot of the time in that I tend to be a strong supporter of markets as a solution to environmental issues, at least as a middle term type of solution. Maybe it doesn't fix the underlying questions. But I'm asking, do you think that this belief that we can utilize markets effectively to fix environmental problems, is that real, or is that a self-deception in the same way that you're saying these kind of ideas about race were used to justify a practice that had been put in place
Well,
already?
let me see if I can answer with an example. Tell me if this example is in any way satisfactory. So we were talking about your plastic bottle earlier. So that plastic bottle is made out of petrochemical plastics and has endocrine disruptors in it, which we can quantify in your body after you drink it. That's true. So can you make that bottle out of something else? Yes, you can make it out of corn, you can make it out of potatoes. Let's take the state of Maine. I wrote a whole chapter about the state of Maine. The state of Maine used to have one of the, maybe the biggest potato farming agriculture in the country. They grew a lot of potatoes up in what's called Aroostook County up in the northern Maine. When McDonald's said we're only going to buy potatoes from Idaho, the Maine potato industry collapsed. There's basically no more potato economy up there. What if you created a market that said, you know what, it is now illegal to make water bottles out of petrochemicals because they're bad for you. Let's instead make them out of potatoes and we'll put all those Maine farmers back to work. So why hasn't that happened? There's a market-based solution. What we're going to do is we're going to regulate this thing and create a market for something else. I would think that even a capitalist would say that's a fair exchange. This is bad, this is better, and the side benefit is we'll put a whole bunch of people to work. So a market-based thing requiring regulation. So what's wrong with that? I'll give you another example. In Europe, they have what they call the precautionary principle. Like if a company makes a new lipstick, the company has to test that lipstick to see if it's going to cause problems for the women that buy it. And they cannot release that out onto the market until they prove it. In the United States, basically they say, chuck your lipstick out on the market, and if somebody gets sick, they can sue you. And of course, who's going to win that lawsuit? Like, there's no way that you can say my breast cancer came from that one tube of lipstick. You know? So Europe, you can't release it on the market until it's fully proven to be safe. The United States, chuck it out on the market. If people get sick, it's up to them to get satisfaction. So in Europe, there are 400 chemicals going into cosmetics right now that are illegal, that are legal in the United States. So they said these are dangerous chemicals. We're like, whatever. So how do you fix that? In Europe, they say you can't do this. And so the market has created less toxic cosmetics. In the United States, we have this ethic, which is like, let companies do whatever they want, because the whole idea is to get as rich as you can. It has nothing to do with public health or precaution. It's just like, just send it out there. And I won't ask this of this group, but I've often asked rooms of people, raise your hand if you've got cancer, like super close to your family. And like every hand in the room goes up. And not only that, but all kinds of other issues. And we don't know what links are direct, but we just know that we're all kind of wrapped up in this thing. And you pull one thread and it leads a lot of different places.
Well, I think we've got students that are going to need to go to classes. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.